Hi everyone and welcome to another episode from The Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I'm here once again with my co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
We have a very special guest this week. She's appeared on this podcast before, but we thought we'd talk about her own work this week. And we have Associate Professor Marcelle Freiman. Hi Marcelle.
Hi Steph. Hi Michelle.
So I thought I'd read a little bio of Marcelle because we are focusing on her own creative work today. So Marcelle Freiman has published 2 books of poetry, White Lines, which came out in 2010, and Monkey's Wedding, which came out in 1995. Monkey's Wedding was highly commended for the ASAL Mary Gilmore Award in 1996. Marcelle's work has also appeared in literary journals in Australia and overseas, including in Antipodes, Blue Dog, The Bulletin, Court-Eyed Poetry Review, Coonapipi, Mascara Literary Review, Meniscus, Southerly, Stand Magazine, and has been read on radio and in performance. So Marcelle's creative work includes poetry, the rise of visual arts in poetry, roles of memory and cognitive experience in writing. She's a member of the Sydney-based poetry group Diverse, which is about writing and performing poetry based on visual arts and objects in museums and galleries. So, Marcelle, that's a very impressive bio there. It was actually a bit of a mouthful to read out. Can you talk about how you started writing poetry?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question, Steph. I actually started writing poetry when I was at school. And I had a poem published in the school magazine, which I no longer have.
Oh, that's a shame.
But it was kind of encouraging. Nevertheless, I didn't write any poetry while I was an undergraduate studying English. And I actually started writing poetry again as a young adult when I left South Africa in 1977 and went to live in London.
Right.
And I think that was really where the real creative spark of my poetry started, where I had things I needed to say, and the only way I could say them was in poetry. And I started then really with a lot more seriousness.
Yeah. So what was it about that move from South Africa?
Well, it was an immigration. It was a real cut from where I had grown up. It was a cut of place. It was an exciting thing to do. It was a very valuable thing and an important thing. But it was also very confronting, leaving one's life, one's family, one's homeland. And I left gladly.
Yeah.
I wanted to go. And it was only afterwards that I realised that it wasn't so simple, because I was young, and you do things like that when you're young. So I think it was that sense of also being away from my extended family, and I think it was the need to try and connect with who I was in relation to that family that were absent and that place.
So was your early work then in this period quite political in nature, or was it more personal?
No, it wasn't political at the beginning. It was more personal. But the political stuff and the stuff about the country, which was going through such incredible turmoil right through the 80s, 90s, that started to be part of my story.
Yeah. So it was impossible to
tell.
Yeah.
But there was a time, for a long time, from the 1970s all the way through to about after 1996, when they had the new South Africa was kind of on the road, where it was not okay to tell your white South African story.
Yeah.
I remember going to workshops and people would say, "Why are you telling this? We're not interested. You're white."
Yeah, that's interesting,
and
isn't
so the whole racial thing kind of got transported along with me. I was a symptom of apartheid without actually even have chosen it.
Even though you were fleeing apartheid,
I was
really.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and had resisted it, and that's why I left. It wasn't read that way.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I had to really overcome quite a lot of, and then of course you self-censor, so I had to overcome that. And it was when my work became better received, when the world around was more receptive, the workshops that I went to were more receptive, that it started to be that big part of my life could start becoming part of my poetry. But at the beginning it was more about place, it was about coming to Australia, it was about England, and also about family. But it wasn't really looking at what happened in the place I lived in, which was a very big story.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's such a kind of vexed question at the moment, isn't it? Like, who can write whose experiences?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
What voices are speaking.
And to sort of to sort of say, well, you know, for good or bad, this is my story.
Mm.
And then start to put it in, you know, to start to develop the confidence to do that. And that only comes with getting some poetry acceptances and recognising that, yes, you know, I can say something, people think it's good enough to publish, so people want to listen.
Well, people were listening in your school days, so...
Yes, they were, but I forgot. And I had a lot of encouragement from my grandmother who knew I liked to write as a child and said to me, don't neglect your talent, with her finger wagging.
But I think even in your sort of early poetry, there's a sort of a potency in the way that you deploy place. You know, that I think that even when it's not sort of, and that's not to sort of reduce that potency to, you know, sort of the political, but just perhaps that more complex position that you felt in sort of being effectively exiled, I guess, in a sense, from a country that you know, I can't imagine a more stark contrast between, you know, sort of the incredible you know, sort of landscape of South Africa to London. I mean, I just, you know, the shock of that in terms of, you know, climate, in terms of you know, sort of the form in every way.
You know, it was such an interesting time in my life because it was like going into the storybooks. It was the seasons where, oh, this is what they meant. Oh, this is what blackberries look like. This is what daffodils are. This is what Enid Blyton was about.
This is a white Christmas.
I'm in it.
Yeah.
You know, it was the true kind of post-colonial back to the centre story.
I actually think you feel that in Oak.
Yes,
you know,
that actually is what Oak is about in White Lines. Do you want me to read it?
Look, that'd be lovely, because I think you capture that.
Okay, well, it's really interesting because this was one of the poems that took a very long time to arrive. It started off as one thing and then I developed it further many years later. But I think that the key here was that it was about what was my relationship as a person who'd grown up in a kind of colonial country like South Africa, very much like Australia was colonial, except we had all the other apartheid stuff to deal with, which I always think of as colonialism ramped up about 1 million.
Well, but if we're going to be really frank, Australia's history is not necessarily
it's very much similar, and there was a lot more owning of what happened in South Africa than there ever has been here. But it was about what did that mean to go to England as someone who'd grown up in South Africa, and I think that's what this poem's about. I'll read it and you'll see what I mean. So this is actually based on just before I go on, it's based on an exhibition in the Powerhouse Museum where they exhibited like lesson cards, like for very early TAFE colleges in Sydney, where they had different trees and you know, woodworking, like so the one for the wood from oak. Now oak is a very English tree, but that was included in what you learnt about wood.
You've got to learn about ye old England,
in Australia. So you're starting to be a carpenter, and you have to learn about oak wood, which, you know, it's one of those. It's like people in Africa learning about Jane Austen and Shakespeare. So
it's incongruous.
So that was kind of informing what I did here. Oak. The lesson card from England pointed to the oak as native tree. And singing, "Oh, Danny boy and my Bonnie," our childish voices lifting to green hills and valleys. We learned how we'd never be at home in the veldt and dusty kikuyu grass outside the classroom windows, birth-written by our whiteness, either to rule or leave. England called us. Better there, the ordered world, safe. But we'd pine like animals for the smell of African sand, strong as flint, strong in our veins. The summer we travelled to Stonehenge, my hands turned to artefacts. I was seeking my history in the broken circle of stones, as if my language would assure, and the moon of Delamere would shed its silver, cool as mercury. But the immigrant had lost her words. White puppet on a stalk, turned her face again to find the sun, where the earth is red stubble on a blue Pacific coast with pink hibiscus. I count the years since leaving the yellow felt. In the 5th, the puppet petals dropped. The 8th, I sent a tapestry, patterns of words on canvas, threaded with the brown and gold of sand and memories. The year our Sydney garden was shaded by an old oak tree, I rubbed my back against her crusty bark, like an antelope itching with dust.
That's lovely.
So that's about my double immigration from South Africa to England and from England here to Australia.
And that is such a technically difficult thing to achieve, because
3 settings, yeah.
The settings, the movement in time, and to sort of retain a reader from beginning to end through some really vivid, potent images. I mean, that was one of the moments, and I think that image of the puppet is such a powerful way of thinking through the way that it feels to be confronted with histories and stories and that are supposed to be your own, but
like something else is pulling the strings, I suppose. That sense of being a string puppet, you know. Thank you. I mean, I appreciate what you say, and you know, when I write a poem like this, I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to end up. And I guess when I finished this one, I was a little bit concerned that all the moves through space, through different places, would come through. One would have to be able to pick, you know, the references to Stonehenge, for example, and you know, to Danny Boy and to Walter de la Mare, and to the education that I had that was so English-based, just like here in Australia was in the 1950s. And then finishing it off, it really all came together when I remembered that, of course, we had an oak tree in Sydney. You know, and yeah, it was that sort of the transported species.
You know, I was recently in Port Arthur in Tasmania, and they've got one section of the old kind of the old prison village is completely planted out with English plants, because they wanted to, the wealthy people wanted to look out and see England, because it's cold in Tasmania. And they thought, if we just plant all of these, you know, dig up all the native and indigenous plants and just plant oak trees and, you know, English roses and all of this, then we can look out, and because it might be raining, we'll pretend we're in England. And I thought that was such a kind of interesting way of transforming a little pocket of Australia into England in this kind of really forced and interesting way.
It is, but it's actually even more endemic, because when you think of the early artists who came out here, like John Glover, for example, who came from Scotland, and when they were confronted with the Australian landscape, the way they started painting it was like using a kind of John Constable type of arrangement, but trying to get those gum trees in the light. It took about a generation of artists before they could actually inhabit the light and the place of Australia. So that being in 2 places at once thing is very, for me, the sense of being in more than one place at a time is something I just live with. Yeah. You know, so...
And that comes through in that poem.
Does it?
Yeah. How long does it take you to write a poem like that? Because you said it took a while for it to come, and I don't write anything creative, so I'm very fascinated by all this.
You know, it's such a funny thing, because some of these poems come quite quickly all at once, and then they get reworked. Yeah. But others kind of take a long time, especially often when they are quite deep, in a sense, you know, without being sort of coy about it. But there's an exploration to be made through the poem. In other words, that I'm not quite sure what that exploration will be or what it's about. Like, we've been doing some work in creative writing classes about this, about how sometimes you have to write something to find out what you really want to write about, which may not be quite that thing, particularly when you're dealing with things that are very close to you or memories and things like that. And so sometimes a poem can take a long genesis because it hasn't quite arrived. And I wasn't happy with this poem for a very long time. That's why I say it took a long time to write. And it had started off being about Stonehenge and living in England, but then I was working on this project at the Powerhouse Museum, and one of the exhibits there were these lesson cards. And so I looked at that and I thought, oh, I need to finish this poem. And so I went and hauled this out and I rewrote it. And only the few bits that stayed were like the Stonehenge bit and the puppet bit. That was there from the beginning. But a lot of the other stuff really only came. This was an unfinished poem in my notebooks. You know, I had typed it out, but I knew that it hadn't come together, so it was just sitting there. And I went and got it. This doesn't often happen. And I reworked it because I was writing for this particular event with Diverse, but also because actually revisiting that poem was really important for me at the time. And so when I say it took a long time, I didn't work on it all the time. There were long gaps. But a poem can take... Even if I am working on it quite consistently, it could still go through so many draftings. Usually got about 20 poems on the go at the same time.
Wow.
So, you know, it's not like I write one and then I finish it and I write another one. It's never like that. I've got this kind of mash of poems, and then I'll decide, oh, it's time to start sending some stuff out to journals. Let me see what's finished. And I'll go through what's finished and it's not quite finished, so I'll work some more on it, and eventually, okay, I can send this out now. So I'll collect like a group of poems that I can then send into the world.
Because you do a lot of work working with pen and paper, don't you?
Yes.
Which, you know, sort of creates a sort of a stepped, you know, a stepped path towards finishing, doesn't it? Because there's that movement from, you know, sort of the handwritten to the typing it up, which does so much to change a poem. I mean, it's almost sort of denuding it or something, isn't it?
Well, it looks so fresh when it hits the screen. I mean, what happens is that I always draft a poem by hand. I have never started a poem on screen. So it'll always be by hand, and it gets kind of mishmashed about and added to and crossed out, and balloons, and, you know, go to page X, and you know, until literally I think, God, I've really got to get this onto, you know, into another shape because I can't see it anymore, and then I'll write it up. I used to actually write it up by hand again, but now I go and I'll put it straight onto the computer. Even in that process, though, I'll be reshaping, changing line lengths, and working a lot more with lines, because I'm now working on something that looks more like a printed page.
Because it's actually very difficult to sort of work in Word with, you know, sort of inserting, you know, sort of right aligned and left aligned, and then, because in some of your poems we have that sort of beautiful visual layout on the page, and I mean that's quite painstaking to do, is it not?
Well, there's a reason for every positioning of a line within a poem. I mean, that other one that's we were looking, I thought I might talk about, is like that one. Yeah, that's the one.
Country of Birth.
That's the one that was recently published. And
So this is Country of Birth.
This poem is Country of My Birth, which I don't like the title anymore. However, that's what it was published as. So when it goes in the book, it's getting a new title. But it's actually, it started off like one of the, you know, those kind of Wordsworthian titles, because it was very much a situated poem. I wrote it on a day.
Right, okay.
And
That's interesting.
it felt appropriate that day should be in the title. So it's Country of My Birth, lines written 27th of June 2013.
Well, at least you'll never forget what day it was.
I will never forget what day it was. And I was actually on a plane. I was about to get on a plane to London,
right,
to see my family there. And I had read a newspaper in the airport, and there was a thing there that said that Nelson Mandela was very ill and was in hospital. And that kind of brought a whole rush of feeling into me, because of my regard for Nelson Mandela, but also for my fears of what would happen when Nelson Mandela was not there to keep people, to keep the country in a way, more or less, even though he wasn't the president anymore, But to me, he was an absolute spark of hope that came out of apartheid and made apartheid end without everybody getting killed.
It was an incredible.
It was incredible.
Feat,
it was
I mean,
incredible.
just,
It was extraordinary. He's just one of those extraordinary figures. And needless to say, I've read his biographies and all the stories about his life and being in prison in Robben Island and all the hardships, because they actually ended up being quite close to my own history in terms of various things that I've alluded to in this poem, which I'm not going to go into. There's a lot of my own biography in here. But what happened is I got on that plane and I still had this feeling of emotion, and I thought, I need to write something. So I took out my notebook and I started to write this poem, and I started to write it with that sense that Nelson Mandela lived his life in South Africa the same time that I was growing up in South Africa. There was this kind of column of fact. And then alongside it was my life in South Africa as a separate thing. Now, this was like the separation of apartheid, but also a separation of generations. I was younger. And it was also the separation of... Behind this was the fact that when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about Nelson Mandela at all. And it was only later that I found out that he was this amazing person who'd been imprisoned because he believed that apartheid should come to an end, that he fought for a new South Africa, that he was part of the development of the African National Congress, which was banned. All these movements, these resistance movements, the way the South African government would handle anything like this, it was draconian. They would just ban it. And everybody in it was banned, and maybe under house arrest or maybe thrown in prison or worse. And so there you had the silence. Okay, so I grew up in a world, and as a child, because children don't know these things anyway, but even as I was growing up, there was so much going on that I never knew about. Censorship was rife. I mean, white people did not know what was going on in the black world. That was the fact of apartheid. The papers didn't tell the right stories. They didn't tell the real stories.
It's really indicative of the potency and the power of that sort of censoring, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was a totalitarian regime where everything we thought that we thought or we were given was decided by someone else. The censorship was extraordinary.
And isn't that an odd thing to find out more about what's actually happening in your country when you're not in it?
Absolutely.
Than when you are.
When I started to get inklings of this as I was growing up, and we had some amazing teachers at my school, and who sort of indicated to us that there was more to this than we were actually being had in our history syllabus. Which
is a brave
thing. Very brave thing. It was in a state school as well. And so, and you knew because there were people in my community who were working for anti-apartheid movements and who were, who, particularly amongst, Jewish South Africans, there was definitely a resistance, but people didn't want to talk about it because it was actually dangerous. The police had complete powers, the security police. So it was that sort of a place. And so there was this world where even if there were stories, they were whispered. They were just inklings of them. And then there was what I then found out after I went to London and I started reading was about what actually happened. The strikes, the protests, the imprisonments, the trials, by the time I got to university, I had learned quite a lot. I was much more keyed in, but even then, there was so much I didn't know. And so all that kind of came on me on that plane, where, let's face it, you're neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And so I started writing the poem, and it was coming out almost like it was on a left-hand column of what I then learned, and on the right-hand column about what I didn't really know and how I lived.
It's amazing the way the page can set up that sort of dialogue.
Yeah, the page actually set it up, and when I typed it out from my notebook, and my notebook actually shows this, is there was this patterning. And I wanted to keep that. To me, that was a key part of the conceptualization of what I was trying to do. So the whole poem has got lots of spacing, And I actually love working with spacing like that. It's fantastic because you can get rid of punctuation.
It's the only time in your life when you can go, now
Absolutely.
throwing all
And
punctuation
there's also
out.
some subjects that, sort of punctuation seems to belittle or
It
hold
just,
up. Or,
yeah. So, just because we're doing a podcast, I mean, I can read a little bit of it.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
But it will be hard for me to say when I'm on the right or the left. So it
you'll-
might be that
it
the
is-
listener has to know.
Yeah. This one's available. It's in.
It is, yes, it is
transnational-
available. You can get
Is
it
it online.
It's
or
online.
it is-
Transnational literature. It's open source.
It's an open
So
source.
it's an open source journal. Was published earlier this year. Okay, so you'll see from where I start off where the poem started. Today Nelson Mandela is ailing in a Pretoria hospital in the land I fled in 1977, anxious as a duiker. How did I hate a country where I knew so much silence? In blank surfaces of days, did not hear his voice, his fugitive life, the Boksburg strikes when our grandparents lived of May 1961, his words that rang across the courtroom of his truth in 1962 were treason in the Sunday Times, whispers overheard at home of Rivonia. That was where the trials, they were called the Rivonia trials. Names splintered the night. My father at the table with a whiskey, something about Bram Fisher. Dad knew of his arrest. I was 13 in 1964, skinny, growing, knew nothing of the people's words from rooftops, stations, sidings, factories. My ears were stopped. Then whispers would turn to more. Bold teacher taught high school girls our history, while censors rained fear on us. 7 years later, in 1971, at 19, truth would out. White protests, students. The blue uniform policeman, brown leather holster, revolvered me in revolving door between action and fear, snatched from my hands the Roneo leaflets, black ink still damp, stains on my fingers. But we marched our placards down Commissioner Street, law student boyfriend protective. If the cops come, run. And we ran, and then heard of leaders, writers, slipped in showers, they said, in John Forster Square, or fell from windows. Brothers, students, arrested at university gates, were released on the Vice-Chancellor's plea. Police promises not to record crimes of protest were betrayed, we later discovered, and all white boys had to do their time, army conscripts at 18, to fight for, on behalf of, apartheid. So that's part one of that poem.
You know, as you were reading, I mean, I could see what you were reading, so maybe I'm biased by that, but I could also hear the different lines. I think you could hear where you had indented and then come back.
Yeah, it kind of... it was what I couldn't see and what I learnt. But it kind of came together in those university days. But there was that sense still always of that divided world.
I think that with the sort of the reading of the poem where we can't see it, I think what you can feel is the sort of the pendulum movement, sort of that backwards and forwards, which, sort of I think happens when we see things on the page, and it changes the way that we read, and it changes the way we process information as well, doesn't it? Because, that was the sort of the auditory cue, I think, that just sort of swung back and forth, and then, sort of as the sort of the poem gathered force, there was a real sense of centering, I think.
I think, look, I've redrafted it quite a lot, but the basic inherent structure of the line placing on the page stayed. I cut quite a bit. There's a lot more. It was a lot more histrionic. The first draft was a lot more emotional. I pulled that back a lot. It's still there. It's still there, but I've pulled that back, and that often happens.
Oh, Marcelle, on a plane, I can barely function. So if you're writing poetry on a plane, you're beating me.
It was a good outcome.
Yeah, I've never had such a productive plane.
No, normally I sit like a blob, and that's all I want to do. But in this case, I was terribly upset by the fact that Nelson Mandela, was ill and ailing, and was just incredibly upset by that news.
It's often the measure of somebody great, isn't it? That ability to sort of to touch on a sort of a really quite personal level, on a deep level.
Yeah, and also just knowing, like, because when I'd read his biography and I recognised, oh my God, there were strikes in Boxburg. My grandparents lived in Boxburg. We went there every Sunday for lunch. I never knew there were strikes there. Big strikes.
That's,
protests at the station, police.
That's hard to process, isn't it?
Like, what? Because he documents all of it, of course, Look, I was young, admittedly, so maybe it's easy to be shielded, but it wasn't something that was talked about. Even I was a newspaper reader. I listened to the radio. There was nothing.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful way of kind of looking at the politics of a totalitarian state through that lens of knowing versus not knowing, and you being in this place and thinking you understand this place because you think you understand your home, right?
And then you don't.
And then you don't. Or you see a completely different perspective.
You find you don't, yeah. And I talk about this a lot with my older brother, who's only 18 months older than I am, and he was one of those boys who was arrested, a student, because that actually happened. This was a student protest we were involved in. That thing about the policeman and the revolving, that happened. It scared me so much. It was horrible. To be sort of muscled and jostled and kind of pushed.
It's shocking, isn't it?
By a policeman with a gun.
If you can't, like the police,
no,
you
it was
can't
at
trust
that
the
point,
police.
like if I hadn't, I always knew I was going to leave South Africa, but at that point, I definitely knew that I was not going to stay. But at the same time, there was so much betrayal because I went to a liberal university and our vice chancellor was right behind the students.
Yeah, it completely reconfigures, sort of our understanding of the role of vice chancellors and universities.
Oh no,
and
this was different.
and,
This was, and I remember the vice chancellor going out to the gate and talking to the police on behalf of the students because they were bludgeoning the students.
Marcelle.
And a lot of people were arrested and they just wanted to scare them, but the vice chancellor said, "I don't want any of these students who are arrested to have a criminal record." To say that they were ever arrested. And they, oh, no, we won't do that. They did it. And then so when, for example, my brother applied to leave the country, this came to light that he had this record of having been arrested during this protest.
So just
the words mean nothing, don't they?
No, absolutely. And there was conscription. So all the boys that I knew, the males, they all had to go into the army.
And I bet a lot fled because of it.
Well, a lot tried to go. A lot left the country.
Yeah.
My former husband went. He went after he had done his medical training, and so if you waited till after your medical or legal training, you could go in as an officer, and there you could actually get some kind of reasonable job where they're not going to send you to Angola to fight in the war or something, because there was a war in Angola and Namibia. Also not spoken about. Not spoken about.
Military service.
Military service, and so they all had to do it, poor things. So we went, and I spent my time with him at the time. We were already married, where he was just posted out to very, very remote African areas to work as doctor in mission hospitals. There's a whole story there.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Anyway, okay, so did you want to ask me any other questions?
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to know some of your influences, some of your poetic influences.
Our poetic influences. Yeah. This is like a growing thing because it doesn't stop. It changes so much all the time because I'm always reading poetry and I'm always seeing a poet do something and I think, oh, how clever, look at that, or I want to try that. Just in terms of the poets that I've always loved, I think this really started when I came back to university here in Australia. To do a master's degree here at Macquarie. I think the poetry I read then started to have a big influence on my own, just on how I thought about poetry. So of course there were the classics, Yeats, Eliot, Plath. Anne Sexton, who are no longer influences for me, Sharon Olds at one point, and all those confessional poets. There were influences there. but to be honest, I don't feel, and I know you're not supposed to say this because I know every poem is coming out of stuff that's been written before, but I never feel the weight of other poets before me when I write. I just write.
I think that you can feel that in your poetry, because what I always feel is that, you know, sort of no matter how differently you approach your subject, no matter what form it takes, no matter, it always feels so very centred in something that's particularly Marcelle Freiman, and I think we were actually talking about this, and I think that there's a because obviously I have the privilege of knowing you, but I think that there's a strength of character that carries through into your poetry, where I don't know that there would be room for the sorts of, because lots of poets do the sort of the intertextual nods and the this and the that, whereas that I don't think is a feature of your poems.
It's not a main feature. Thank you. I mean, that's really interesting that you say that. I will say that the form of the poems and what happens in them comes out of the poem. It doesn't come from externals, I'm going to write one of those poems or these poems. But there might be a time where I think, yes, I'm going to try this poem, but I'd actually like to try and use those long lines like C.K. Williams does. I don't know if you know C.K. Williams, but he writes incredibly long lines, or what's her name? That American poet who writes terribly long lines. It's fascinated me that they do that. I can't remember.
I'm just actually wondering if it's on my...
Youre Graham.
Yeah.
Youre Graham. She writes very, very long. Her books were published... This book published by Blood Axe, which is like that.
So it's a long physical
landscape side.
Almost like that, so the lines can... And then she'll kind of append some lines coming down. And I have tried out poems just to kind of explore what happens when you use a longer line. Because the line to me is absolutely key to what I'm doing. Every line has to work.
I'm just smiling because I'm just thinking of something that Pio wrote recently, where he was sort of, talking about the militarisation of the line.
Yes.
And, you know, sort of in poetry, there's been such a move towards, you know, sort of the compressed lines and to sort of break into the very long, you know, sort of longer than prose, longer than the standard page, longer than this.
Yes.
Seems really kind of radical and exciting.
It does seem radical, and I think coming out of, you know, when you go back to W.C. Williams and the kind of the...
Oh, William Carlos Williams.
Yeah,
of course.
But I'm thinking of C.K. But for C.K. Williams is a different poet, and he's the one he writes extremely long lines. They always spill over. And I've read some, and he does narrative. He does narrative poems. And so I'm very fascinated in how to bring narrative into poetry. It's there, but how to consciously work more with narrative, and at the same time to explore the long line, but not be writing prose. And so I have a very interesting example, which I always tell my students in other units about, which is I decided I was going to write a poem with long lines. Okay, spilling over. And so I set out, and I had this idea which poem it was good. A poem that I thought, this one needs long... Sometimes a poem does need long lines. Like my poem, 1971, in White Lines, it wanted longer lines. They're not that long, but they're longer than what I usually do. And so for this one, they were going to be very long lines. They were going to at least go to the end of an A4 page and then have to start it and have to drop down a bit in the next line to finish, or they'd just be a whole length. And I started off writing this poem, and it was interesting in many ways because I enjoyed the range that you could get with a longer line. It's very different what you can do with a long line and a short line. And it's still a poetic line, but it's not a compressed line. It's a more drawn out line. So what are you going to do with rhythm there? What are you going to do with sound? What are you going to do with your build-up of images in the one line before you then go on to the next line? But what happened with this poem, this is one that has taken me so long to work on, is I got so trapped by having to have each line that long. And so I struggled with this poem a lot. And then I realised I had to let go of this beloved idea that every single line was going to have to be that long.
Long, yeah.
And maybe if I let some lines be a bit shorter, I could actually get this poem finished.
It's a good lesson there about not deciding too much about your form.
But also, look, first of all, the thing that happened is what happens to a lot of writers of prose is that you start putting lots of detail and you get very caught up in the concrete detail and it's all lovely, but hang on, then it becomes too much. Overkill. You know, it becomes kind of over-determined, if you like. And you think, hang on, no, you have to, it's a long poem. You want someone to read it. Where's it going? It has to show where it's going.
And also just, I think, that notion of the line and that sort of idea of a thought. You know,
yes.
Sort of, you sort of almost want some sort of parallel between a thought and a line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And the line is a kind of unit of meaning. But once I released myself from this kind of pressure that I said, it has to be C.K. Williams' style. He does every line that way. Okay, so I then started to rework it a bit, and what it let me do, which was really good, was it helped me to take out extraneous stuff, and it helped me to also vary the pacing. And to work, this one, you can see how the lines work with the pacing. So with that one, I wanted to bring a bit of that in, but still, have that thing about the long lines. And it is a narrative, and I struggled a lot with that narrative because I don't write narrative, but I was determined. There was a narrative there, and I wanted to tell it, a story. And eventually, I did what I should have done months earlier, was to send it to a fellow poet whom I trust. I sent it to Jerry Kroll and I said, please have a look at this. You write narrative poetry, she writes verse novels. Tell me, what do you think? Is it working as narrative? And she gave me some feedback, which was really great. And some, and
it would be nice because you're always sort of giving.
I'm giving, and I don't take. And I'd actually met up with her ages ago at a conference in London, and we said, why don't we swap poems sometimes? It's such a good thing to do. But of course, neither of us never got round to it. And I thought years later I'm going to take her up on it. So, and then she sent me some of hers and we did a bit of email workshopping, which was very nice. So that was a really interesting lesson in wanting to push new boundaries of form, wanting to explore what can I do with longer lines, and then getting too caught up in that.
Yeah, too caught up in form.
Yeah, and then having to pull back. So I'm not sure. The poem is finished, I think. I did send it out to the Newcastle Prize. It didn't get shortlisted or anything, but that's okay. I'm probably going to go back. I will still go back to it. It'll end up in the book. But yeah.
So when is...
I was just going to ask that.
I'm
There's a new book.
I'm preparing it. At the moment, and this is something that's driving me nuts this semester because this is something I wanted to do. It's like one of my projects. And I'm busy putting together, at least a manuscript of poems that I've published since my last book, which is already a while back, 7 years. I've got quite a lot of poems and also new poems. So I'm in the process of just pulling everything out of my files on the computer and seeing, and the next thing will be to literally print them all and then to start grouping them and see how they're going to fit together, because some are going to probably have to, just won't fit.
The curation of that.
I'm going to have to curate it, because the making of a volume is like, again, a making of another poem.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. How do you make all those sorts of choices about, and what order that they go in as well?
It's a very strange experience, because even in White Lines, these are poems written over quite a long period of time. You start to recognise synchronies between groups. Like poems start to group themselves. They don't, from different times that they were written. But there's some sort of thematic grouping or some kind of an approach grouping or some kind of, I don't know, it was a bit intuitive the way I did it.
Because it's interesting the effect, because I was just thinking back to the last time we had a discussion about poetry, and we looked at your very last poem in White Lines.
Yes.
And there is something about sort of a first poem and a last poem that can actually give a particular quality to the overall work. It's almost like it's a sort of a form of emphasis or italics that sort of introduces an idea that guides the way that you think of the whole.
Absolutely. And you know, when I look at the opening poem, I think that's your copy, isn't it? Yeah, I'll just use mine because it's a bit looser. When you look at the opening poem of White Lines, called Gate, that was a poem that I'd written. I wasn't even going to include it. And then I looked, you know, I was going through all my stuff. I thought, hang on, that could actually be a really nice preamble. Because it's about kind of opening of the gate, walking through, but also all the stumbles that you make on the way.
So that's a beautiful poem to start a collection.
And it really was, you know,
Yeah.
like walking there, like what is this thing, you know, that you're doing? Because that's what the book was actually about. A lot of what, so it set up the tone.
Yeah.
You know, looking all the while ahead with that forceful shining thing, you know, you've lost. It was kind of, this was actually an ekphrastic poem, but I didn't acknowledge the painting because in the end it became such a thing of its own. But this was a poem I wrote in a kind of surge of energy. And a lot of these ekphrastic poems, unlike perhaps the more ploddy ones that I was talking about with the long lines, a number of these that I write standing in front of an image or an object come out in a kind of rush.
So you write a lot of poems based on visual arts.
I do.
And museum exhibits.
I do. And, you know, it all happened by chance.
Yeah.
Years ago, Robert Kennedy had started this group called Diverse. And he was working with a couple of poets whom I sort of vaguely knew. And I saw that they had done a reading in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And I thought, I want to be part of that group. I like what they're doing. Because I was just really interested. So I contacted him and said, look, I think I'd like to actually be part of what you're doing. And, you know, are you interested in, you know, maybe looking at some of my stuff and seeing whether I can join? And, you know, we met and we chatted and I showed him some of my work. And, you know, I went, you know, he said, okay, why don't you do the next gig that we've got booked, which was the Justice and Police Museum. That was my first one.
Wow. Threw you into the dark end, yeah.
It was and the exhibition was, because he was the one who negotiated with cultural institutions to get us a gig. A gig being that we would write on objects in an exhibition, they would advertise us, and we'd do a reading, a performance as part of their kind of social, their program.
It's fantastic. It's so performative, isn't it?
Oh, it's fantastic. And so I did that one. It was called, the exhibition was called Drugs or Social History. And that's when 1971 and the Brett Whiteley poem in here came out, Visionary, and Morphine, that poem about morphine. And not that I'm, you know, but
you're giving an impression of yourself, Marcy.
I'm not into drugs at all. But the whole point was that it was such a fantastic experience for me to just go in and to look at there were you know, opium pipes from early Sydney.
Yeah.
I've got a poem published in Mascara called Yellow, about a woman opium smoker. So I go off and do my research. You know, I went and looked up the history of opium and the opium wars, and you know, because there was this opium pipe that I wanted to write on, and I came up with a poem. You know, I read Richard Flannery. Is it Flannery? His book on early Sydney. He's got a book where he collected a whole lot of primary sources on early life in early Sydney, and there's an observation in there of an opium den.
That strikes me as such good practice as a poet.
Oh, it was fantastic, and I really enjoyed it. And you know, Rob said, "Do you want to be part of our group?" You know, it was great because Jill Jones was in there and a couple of other people. The group has changed over time, and now we're not actually working because Rob's had to go up to Canberra, so we're not doing it. But I'm still working in that way because it was so productive for me. So productive.
Because I think one of the things that I come back to always when I read your poems is that I am constantly surprised by the newness of each poem. That there's this, and I think that there's something so intrepid about the way you approach your poetry, which means that every poem feels at one and the same time, particularly a Marcelle Freiman poem, but also at the same time is adventurous and vigorous and is sort of willing to make unexpected encounters turn into poems, because there is a tendency for some poets to sort of stagnate a little bit, and I don't ever envisage. I mean, I can't imagine that happening with you, and I've certainly never felt that in reading any of your poems.
That's interesting you say that, and I think that a lot of what you're noticing is what happens when I work on these unseen objects, because they take me to places that I haven't. That are fabulous. They're playful. They're dark. They are autobiographical. They're not autobiographical. So I could write just autobiographical poems, which some of these that I've read to you are, but they're not all. And it's enabled me to broaden my range in a way that I'm actually really proud of, because I knew I didn't only want to write from the autobiographical space. Of course, one always does in some way. When you go through a creative process of some kind. But the point is that I also wanted to find my way into Australia. And I've done that through engaging with Australian art and Australian objects and Australian history. Do you want me to read the Patrick White briefcase?
Yeah, I think that would be marvellous.
Hang on, have you got a copy of? Otherwise,
that's good.
So this is a poem based on Patrick White's briefcase.
Yeah. I'll thanks.
Yeah, that's actually Gethsemane.
Oh, no, that's Gethsemane.
Yeah,
no, I'll read this one. It's more fun. So these are two Patrick White poems, actually, this one and Gethsemane. So this is from a diverse event. And this was I don't know if you remember, not that long ago, they had a show that came from the National Library in Canberra, Patrick White, A Life. And there was all sorts of memorabilia from Patrick White, letters, photographs, things. And we actually wrote on stuff in that show. And so, the way we do it is all the poets would go in their own time and go around and see what they could pick to write on and just write, and then we'd all come together. So nobody really knew what the others had written on. And, nobody else wrote on this thing. But I guess there's nothing, you just choose things that spur you. And so there was Patrick White's briefcase. And there was also lots of photos of his office, of his study, of where he worked in his house in Centennial Park, or the one where they had the farm up in Castle. No, where was it? Castle Crag? No, I don't know where. Where him and Manoli had a house. Lots of stuff about Centennial Park, which is right near where I live. Anyway, here was the briefcase, and Patrick White's briefcase. It was a Hepco briefcase, just like my dad used to have.
Lovely.
And that's where I think, oh, okay. And so I've also read all of Patrick White's books. Patrick White has been my entry into Australia.
Yeah. I imagine that's the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I actually had a project going for many years where every Christmas holidays I would read one Patrick White novel. So I've done a lot.
Patrick White for Christmas.
No, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
And I mean, he is a giant. I really am. Some of his books are quite hard to understand, but others are just so powerful. So having him in my head, I guess, and in my experience, the character Hurtle Duffield here is from the Vivisector, which is that one about
the Vivisector,
which is about the artist and the creative spirit of that artist. So, characters from his novel show up in these poems without my bidding because I'm writing about Patrick White. Okay, so this is called Patrick White's Briefcase. It was in Meanjin not long ago. The wild mind wears a tie, workmanlike but formal for writing. Hurtle Duffield's spliced mind, life broken by its fire, painting wildly. A sheaf of papers typed in a leather case with a clasp of brass initialed PW. It's a strong place for stories that fly off the pages, to carry them from this room. What a constellation of love and order and dogs and vegetables and wine on the table. The wildness bloomed a galaxy of stars, leather briefcase alongside, like a watcher.
Oh, I love that. That's lovely, Marcelle. I love that idea of, coming to a novelist or a writer through their material
things.
objects.
Yeah.
I was just thinking maybe perhaps one day somebody will write Marcelle Freiman's handbag.
Well, I mean, it's
backpack.
It was so. I love the fact that I chose that object, that I wrote that poem.
And that you had a nice little link there with your father.
Well, definitely. This going to work every day with a briefcase thing,
And that strong kind of...
that kind of very masculine, very 1960s masculine thing, You
don't see people with briefcases anymore so much, do you?
No. But the sense that he put his manuscripts in there, and the manuscripts were just about falling, like jumping out because of what was in them. So this was fun, and I had a lot of fun at this exhibition, even though I also wrote Gethsemane, which is in cordite, which is about the Ian Fairweather painting that Patrick White had. He owned it, and it was hanging on the wall of his study. So there's a beautiful photograph in that show of him sort of sitting half on his desk, and you've got all these books and his typewriter, and then there's the Fairweather painting behind him. And because he had a nice art collection, he liked to collect Australian artists, that particularly people he befriended. And there were lots of photographs in that show as well. Quite a few photos by William Yang, who's a wonderful photographer, and of these dinner parties and the life in the house. It was there, the dogs, the vegetables, the wine on the table, and it was all there in that room in the State Library where I just sat down and just wrote this poem. And I'll say to you now that this one is almost unchanged.
Amazing. That is really amazing.
Almost unchanged, and they paid me $100 for it.
Look, it's not a lot of money, but
it's not. Any money for a poem is worth millions.
Yeah. It's all about the glory. It's not about the cash.
Yeah,
right?
and funnily enough, I never make this mistake, but because I've been sending out so many poems, I'd actually sent this one out to another journal as well, to Westerly, and they wanted it. Mm-hmm. And I had to say to them, well, no, it's not available anymore because it's just been taken by another journal. And they were lovely about it. She wrote back and said, oh, we'd love to get more stuff from you, but thank you for telling us. But I thought, if I let that go ahead, I don't think it's a good look.
No.
You're not supposed to do that because the journals are publishing new work.
Yeah.
So there was this it was a strange experience. There was, yes, they wanted it.
Two
people wanted this poem that really took me not very long to write.
Sometimes it just works.
But I think it was also the Patrick White thing. I think it's because I'm engaging with Australian literature.
Yeah.
And it made me realise that I've actually probably got a project there.
Oh, okay.
To go back to his books, to his letters.
Yeah.
And to have a read and to just start letting poems happen around this. Because he's inhabited many months of my life with all that reading.
It's time he started giving back.
It's time he started giving back.
Oh, Marcelle, that would be a project to look forward to.
It's a project that's going to happen.
Well, with that little tantalising glimpse into Marcelle's poetic future, we will have to wrap up because we've actually run over time.
Yes.
Thank you, Marcelle. That was absolutely lovely and fascinating to hear about the creative kind of process because, Michelle being a creative person, Marcelle being a creative person, I'm the odd one out here. I don't do anything creative at all. So it's very fascinating to me to hear about all of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Steph, and thanks, Michelle. And I've really enjoyed talking about my work with you today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and I'm sure our listeners will love it too. And please go and buy Marcelle's poetry collections, White Lines, and Monkey's Wedding, because everyone needs to be reading more Australian poetry. This has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. Once again, I'd ask you to please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find the podcast, which is what we want. We want more people to know about Marcelle's writing in particular. We will see you again in 1 week. Bye.